Holland Island, located in the Chesapeake Bay, was once a thriving community, home to over 360 residents. But as the 20th century progressed, the island slowly eroded, and its residents were forced to abandon their homes, resulting in this incredibly eerie image of a final, lone house surrounded by the sea. A haunting reminder of the island's rich history and the force of nature that ultimately led to its demise. But how did things end up this way? Well, it's a story I can hardly believe. So join me as we discover the rise and fall of Holland Island. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Maryland boasts numerous islands that contribute to its popularity as a tourist destination, the range of which is very impressive, from sprawling inhabited ones to tiny remote inlets. Apparently, this landscape was appreciated as far back as the 1600s, when Europeans first arrived. It's historic as well. Notably, the Chesapeake Bay was first explored by Captain John Smith in 1608, who named it. And over the next several centuries, the bay played a crucial role in the development of the American colonies and was a major center for trade, commerce, and agriculture. During the American Revolution, the Chesapeake Bay was a key battleground and saw several significant naval battles. It also played an essential role in the Civil War, with several vital battles also taking place along its shore. Then, in the 19th and 20th centuries, the bay became an essential hub for fishing, oyster harvesting, and shipbuilding. So, what about Holland Island? Well, the island's founding dates back to the 17th century and is named after its first owner, British colonialist Daniel Holland. According to family records, Daniel Holland was born in about 1610 in James City, Virginia, which was British colonial America at the time. His father, Francis Gabriel Holland, and mother, Mary Jane Elizabeth Pink, were only 15 at the time of their son's birth. Anyhow, sources are vague, but we do know that after Daniel Holland acquired the land, it remained relatively inactive for almost 2 centuries. He died on the 17th of May, 1672, in Northumberland, Virginia, at the age of 63. But it wouldn't be until the late 1850s that the island saw a resurgence in activity due to increased fishing. On February the 2nd, 1782, a lease offering described the island as follows: Holland Island, situated at Herring Bay, is different from this town by about 50 miles by land and from Annapolis about 20 miles, most pleasantly situated on the bounty by the Bay of Chesapeake and creeks all around. It contains 800 acres of as rich land as any in the state, about 300 acres of which are clear and under good fence, capable of producing all kinds of products suitable to our climate in the greater perfection. There are but a few houses on this island, but they are sufficient for a tenant to reside in until better and more can be built, which I propose doing immediately. Now, this concept might seem obscure, but the Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States and stretches over 200 miles from its northernmost point to its southern end in Norfolk, Virginia. You see, over time, fishing communities developed on the island. By 1850, a group of families who engaged in fishing and farming had established themselves on the island, and 60 years later, in 1910, it became home to 360 residents, making it one of the most populated islands in the Chesapeake Bay. The island community was equipped with 70 homes, stores, and other structures, including its own post office, a 2-room school with 2 teachers, a church, a baseball team, a community center, and a doctor's office. But how did people make a living there? Well, islanders primarily sustained themselves through oyster dredging, shad fishing, and crabbing. According to Unknown World, they owned a fleet of 41 skipjacks, 10 schooners, and 36 buggies, some of which were constructed on the island itself. Indeed, it was an unusual place to live, resulting in many unique stories. Stories such as when a minister crossed the frozen arm of the bay in the middle of a blizzard. On February the 12th, 1905, the pastor of the Methodist Church at Holland Island crossed the partially frozen bay with a rowboat, with significant ice floes threatening to damage his vessel at every step of the journey. He had all the right motivations, though. You see, the pastor's wife was on the mainland and fell very ill, but due to the weather, communication with the island was cut off entirely. Hence, the pastor was worried sick, but fortunately, when he reached her after this arduous journey, she was already well and, I imagine, charmed by the bravery of her husband. By the beginning of the 20th century, it had become one of the most densely populated islands in the area. Back then, there was no concern about the island's limited space as it thrived economically. Crab trapping and oyster dredging were the main drivers of this growth. However, it wouldn't be until 1914 that the shoreline loss became apparent, and residents and fishermen gradually moved to the mainland for their own safety. Those who remained tried to prevent further erosion from the strong waves by taking measures such as sinking their boats offshore. But as you'll see in the coming chapter, these actions were in vain. Between 1950 and 2000, Holland Island had shrunk to just 80 acres, less than half of its original size. It should also be noted here that this wasn't an isolated issue. By the year 2000, more than a third of Maryland's 4,360 miles of coastline was losing 260 acres a year. Hence, Holland Island was due no special treatment. And despite the undeniable danger in store, a few people believed that they could fight nature's wrath. Astonishingly, there were holdouts as late as the early 2000s, when much of the island had already vanished, and that what remained was already under great danger. An article by Anita Huslin offers perhaps the most detailed final account of an islander's holdout. Reading, storm clouds sud across the sky and the wind splits, chilling rain in his face. But Stefan White is focused on the waves rolling towards him. He straightens his back, still strong after 70 years, to lift another 50-pound sandbag and wait for his nemesis to hit. The waves slam into the side of his wooden house, pulling away another whitewashed shingle and a few more inches of earth. Imagine being alone on a sinking island and trying desperately to save your home with sandbags against an entire bay. Stefan White's attachment to the island went back to his childhood when he frequently visited. In the early 2000s, he was astonished at how this once vibrant town had fallen apart. Recalling, "I looked around and didn't recognize the place. A sleepy village that once existed on the island was gone. Most of the buildings washed into the bay, and the oyster shell roads overgrown with cord grasses and water bushes." At first, he walked around the island trying to orient himself, but the moment he decided to save it seemed somewhat cinematic, as White recalled stumbling across a small graveyard under a huckleberry tree. Brushing the weeds from the headstone, he read the epitaph for a girl named Effie Lee Wilson, born on January the 6th, 1880, and passing away on October the 12th, 1893. The grave read, "Forget-me-not is all I ask. I could not ask for more than to be cherished by my friends, so loving and dear." At that moment, White realized that a girl who's been dead for 100 years was crying out, so he couldn't let the land just disappear. White immediately tracked down the island's owner, who was a Virginia businessman who used the area as a hunting preserve. He explained the severity of the situation and in 1995 persuaded them to sell the property for $73,000, with payments made over time. Although the odds were against him, he went as far as forming a non-profit organization to gather donations used for supplies. Every weekend, he took his aging boat 60 miles south of the Bay Bridge to fill sandbags. Mr. White had more significant ideas, though, as he had requested the Maryland Port Administration use the island as a disposal site for 10 million cubic yards of dredge material from the bay channels. This indeed would have been enough to restore the island to its footprint of 100 years prior. In parallel, he was working on a $200,000 grant from the state and federal governments to construct a breakwater, which would have restored and secured the island entirely. Now, as you might imagine, these efforts fell short entirely. So Mr. White resorted to piling sandbags next to his house. He also purchased a rusty, ramshackled Batman excavator and dredger he planned to fill with sand and sink offshore, which was reasonable as similar solutions have been known to work. A glimmer of hope emerged when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers planned to undertake a $427 million project to move over 30 million cubic yards of sand soil from the bay's shipping lanes to create a 1,100-acre wildlife refuge. John Grill, the leader of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Chesapeake Bay Islands Unit, had a special admiration for White's tenacity and offered technical advice and assistance, but sadly couldn't provide the means as it was a private island. Holland Island was reaching the point of no return. Only a handful of the 60 structures that were once homes, churches, grocery stores, and a baseball field even remained. Most of the graves were already washed beneath the waves, a notion to which Mr. White exclaimed, quote, "There comes a time when you have to battle against the forces of nature. If I dwell on the acuteness of the problem, it could be so discouraging I couldn't do it. So I focus 90% of my time on the solution and remind myself that if I don't do it, no one else will." Yet despite Stefan White's best efforts, the island would cease to exist just a few decades later. When we look at satellite imagery from 1985, it's clear that the inhabitants have left. Most buildings were dismantled, and you can barely trace where the roads used to run. A lone dock appears to be standing towards the northernmost point of the island, but if you move to images from 1998, you'll see a trace of that same dock submerged in the ocean, with a large portion of the land also underwater. By 2006, the imagery becomes more apparent, and you can see traces of structures fading into oblivion. In other words, fading into nothing but water. It's hard for me to understand how anyone could believe that saving a sinking island is even possible. Still, I respect the courageous notion, especially as it was all inspired by the grave of a girl whose only wish was to be remembered. Today, Chesapeake Bay is a significant tourist destination, attracting millions of visitors each year who enjoy its scenic beauty, rich history, and diverse wildlife. And when those visitors admire the beauty of the bay, I somehow suspect that not a single one of them could imagine that beneath it all are the remains of a lost town and a cemetery with a headstone of a girl terrified of being forgotten. And we'll leave it there for today. Please support the channel by clicking subscribe, and if you'd like to watch these episodes ad-free, click join. Until next time, this is Ryan Sokash, signing off.